Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, died this last week. He became president in 1976 following Gerald Ford. He was 100 years old. Now, many people are telling us on the mainstream media, as well as Fox News, what a good guy he was. He taught Bible classes. He was personally a nice man. But really, what we need to look at is that we're not going to get an honest account of his life, nor particularly of his presidency. People might ask the question, well, what difference does it make? He's dead, let him rest in peace. Well, let's ask ourselves this question. Why is it that Marxists, socialists, Democrats continue and always seemingly want to rewrite history? Why do they want to rewrite history? Why is it that Islam wants to rewrite the history textbooks in our school texts regarding the history of Islam? Why do they want to rewrite it? Why do they want to cleanse that history? Well, the reason is, of course, because history has a lot to do with not only identifying who we are and recognizing what we are as a people, but also it gives us a sense of where we have been, which in turn gives us a sense of which way we're going and what direction we're headed. That is to say, for example, if there have been multiple conspiracies in the past and everybody is trying to cover them up, wouldn't it be good to hear about some of those conspiratorial efforts that we might know basically why we have come to the place where we are and where we're headed? So also regarding Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter may have been a good man. He may have taught Bible classes. We'll talk about that in a few moments. But Jimmy Carter was probably one of the worst presidents. He was a globalist. He was a member of several world organizations, wanted a global government for the United States. He drove us into terrible inflation, as well as many other things that we need to note regarding his presidency. One thing that we need to note at the beginning, at the outset, is that Jimmy Carter was an election denier. When President Trump was elected in 2016, Jimmy Carter denied that it was a legitimate election, and he bought into the mainstream lies, perhaps purveying knowingly some of those lies, that somehow it was Russian interference. All of that we know to be a grand lie, but Jimmy Carter bought into that, and he said he was not officially, legally elected. That's amazing to think that he would come out and say those things, that Russia interfered. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Here's something else regarding to Jimmy Carter that many people are not going to, they'd be wanting to forget. And that is that he is linked to Jim Jones, the People's Temple cult leader, the mass murderer, and the communist. Jim Jones wrote to Rosalind Carter for medical aid to Cuba. She replied with a handwritten note to Jim Jones. Now, the background or the backstory to this is the following. The San Francisco politician and the homosexual rapist Harvey Milk wrote to the president, that's to Jimmy Carter, and 3 congressmen in February 1978, and he wanted to get help stopping what he believed to be a smear campaign against Jones and his People's Temple, which at that time had moved to Guyana in 1974. Jones was also linked to former California House Speaker Willie Brown, who boosted Vice President Kamala Harris's political career, and we know how that story ended. So here's quoting another writer. He says, it's important here to detail the role played by Rosalind Carter, wife of President Jimmy Carter. She became enthralled with Jim Jones when she visited San Francisco with then vice presidential candidate Walter Mondale during the 1976 campaign. That's the Jonestown page at the San Diego State University website explains it this way. San Diego State University. She spoke from Jones's pulpit and also had a private dinner with him at a posh San Francisco restaurant. They continued to correspond by letter after that. Rosalind was obviously captivated with Jones, so it is logical to assume that she praised Jones in her subsequent conversations with her husband after she became president. And upon receiving that letter from Harvey Milk a couple of years later, he no doubt recalled his wife's splendid memories of Jones. November 18, 1978, Jim Jones and his gang of cutthroats murdered U.S. Representative Leo Ryan and 2 journalists who went to Guyana to investigate the temple's activities. And after those murders, Jones induced some 900 followers to drink Flavor Aid laced with cyanide. Those who refused were injected, and Jones shot himself in the head. So Jimmy Carter was not only a one-term president, but one of the reasons was because he was linked to such figures as Jim Jones. His presidency ended in mile-high mortgage rates, just like Joe Biden. He boosted interest rates from 11.2% in 1979, then to 13.7% in 1980. By 1981, they'd risen to 16.63%. I myself purchased a car during that time. I believe it was something like 21% interest, and it was a limited car anyway, the Chevelle. At any rate, the average inflation during his presidency was 9.9%. Amazing to think that Jimmy Carter could be eulogized in great terms when he did such harm to the economy of the United States. But not only that, he created the Black Music Month. I suppose he's best known or most well remembered for that, but perhaps it is the foreign policy disasters that we need to look at more carefully. Let's note three basic disasters that Jimmy Carter helped orchestrate, turning these countries that had been our friends over to communist nations, because it shows us that these insiders, by the way, I say insider, meaning that member of the Council on Foreign Relations, he was a member of the Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg groups, and so forth, these one world organizations, these kinds of groups, these are the ones that Jimmy Carter was a member of. We'll talk about some of that in a moment. And all of them have in mind pro-communist one world government. And right according to script, Jimmy Carter turned over 3 nations to the communists during his presidency, and we're still feeling the effects of those things today. Number 1 is Rhodesia. Rhodesia was once productive. It was turned into a Marxist wasteland, however, called Zimbabwe. Jimmy Carter imposed sanctions to overthrow the white majority, because everything, of course, was black and white, and we've got to get rid of the white majority, let the blacks be in charge. And so the AfricanBusiness.com website noted this. Zimbabwe, for instance, was considered the breadbasket of Africa. Now, this is the AfricaBusiness.com website. Zimbabwe was considered the breadbasket of Africa, with one of the most fertile lands on the African continent, exporting wheat, tobacco, and corn to the rest of the continent and beyond. However, most of the farming, till a few years back, was in the hands of white farmers, 4,000 of whom owned almost 70% of the fertile land in Zimbabwe. But because it was primarily white-dominated government, our insiders, the mainstream media, they began beating the drums about apartheid and how terrible it was in Rhodesia. So Carter-backed Marxist Robert Mugabe and his revolutionaries, who quickly destroyed the nation's economy, turned it into a net food importer. So Carter backed a Marxist Mugabe and put him in charge of Rhodesia. That was, or at least helped him become that position. So we had Rhodesia, country that was friendly to the United States, did have a white majority in government, but that was unsatisfactory, and that was the excuse that Carter used to turn over Rhodesia to the Marxists. Nicaragua. Carter also terminated military assistance to Nicaragua to weaken the president, Anastasio Somoza, which helped the communist Sandinista revolutionaries to power 1979. You recall that incident. So all of that, of course, brought on in 1979. Nicaragua faced all these communists and the Sandinista revolutionaries, but those are the ones that Carter favored. And so Carter helped put the Sandinistas in power. So not only Rhodesia, but Nicaragua went to the communists with help from Jimmy Carter. But perhaps one of the most sordid tales of the Carter presidency was turning Iran over to the revolutionary, the Marxists, who are basically the Islamist Marxists, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Gave it to the mullahs. Now, there's a book called The Last Shah of Iran. You might look it up, but the one that comes up is not the one that you need to read. The Last Shah of Iran, written by Hussein Nahavandi, a book that I read several years ago. It's difficult to get The Last Shah of Iran by Hussein Nahavandi, Nahavandi. Nahavandi was the prime minister or one of the closest aides to Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, who was the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was our friend. We had great correspondence with Iran. He was sending many Iranian students over to the United States. We had an exchange program. He raised the median income in the whole country of Iran. He was not a hardliner Muslim, but the insiders, Council on Foreign Relations, who want us to be always in a world war, always want us to be at war, the Trilateral Commission wants us always to be in war, both of which Jimmy Carter was a member of, turned that country over to Ayatollah Khomeini. It's interesting to read. We don't have time to go into it, but you can read about how Ruhollah Khomeini was staying in a particular place in France, and it was just a great pavilion, and it was guarded by even CIA members. And Hussein Nahavandi tells the story, how sad it was, because they thought, the Shah thought, himself thought, and the government, that the United States was friends with Iran. But little did he know, and it was only too late, did they find out that Jimmy Carter actually cut their throat. He said, kicked the Shah out he put it like a dead mouse, said he could come to the United States, and then, of course, when the Shah was on his way to the United States, Jimmy Carter changed his mind. You can't come here. He ended up going to Mexico. But be that as it may, Iran was turned over to the Shah, or rather from the Shah to Ayatollah Khomeini, hardline Muslim, and they have been our enemies ever since. So, you know what it may be? People say, well, Jimmy Carter, rest in peace. But Jimmy Carter helped make the world a more dangerous place, even today, that we are facing. As a matter of fact, I knew a man, an Air Force colonel, that had been in Iran as one of our attachés, and he had been in Iran in 1970, I guess it was 1977, 78, 79, in that period of time. And he had to be escorted out because at that very moment, the Shah was being betrayed by Jimmy Carter. And when the revolutionaries under the mullahs came in, the Islamic revolutionaries came in, they were lining up many people that had been in the Shah administration, some of his chiefs of staff, and they were lining up on walls and shooting them right there. That's exactly what this colonel tells me, and they escorted him out, and he escaped to the United States, back where he came from. But that's what happened with the Shah of Iran, and Iran got turned over to Ayatollah Khomeini. Let's talk about the Trilateral Commission for just a moment. Carter packed his administration with, he himself was a member of, the Trilateral Commission. These are deep state people, such as National Security Advisor Brzezinski. He was a member on the Council on Foreign Relations. He was a member of the Bilderberg Group, a founder of the Trilateral Commission. Now, John McManus writes this regarding the Trilateral Commission. It labeled itself, or it still labels itself, as a non-governmental, policy-oriented discussion group. Jimmy Carter's a member of this group, or was a member of this group. The TC claims as its purpose, quote, to encourage understanding, closer cooperation among these three regions on shared global problems that would include in North America, Asia, the Orient, let's see, I think maybe South America, North America, Asia, Europe. At any rate, the different continents, to bring them together into a world government. That's the idea. In its own website, it makes clear that the overall goal of the Trilateral Commission is to smooth the path toward interdependence. That's the goal. This would be accomplished through annual meetings and a stream of publications designed in part to, quote, counteract economic and political nationalism. You can read it this way: America First. Any America First agenda is absolutely anathema with the Trilateral Commission. Oh, now you know why Jimmy Carter hated Donald Trump, why he was a Democrat. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission to get us into a world government. They hate independence of the United States, America First agenda, all out. We want political interdependence. So the TC considers interdependence good, any form of nationalism bad. Anyone who scrutinizes TC's self-description or any of its trialogue publications will find no support for our nation's Declaration of Independence, no support for the Constitution. Instead, global charters from the United Nations. It's significant that the TC started with an office in mid-Manhattan, but is now situated in Washington, D.C., where its influence on America's government can be wielded more efficiently. Labeling itself as a non-governmental, policy-oriented discussion group, the Trilateral Commission claims its purpose is to encourage understanding, closer cooperation among three regions on shared global problems, as we mentioned, and is working toward interdependence. So we can best grasp it by knowing some of its roots for just a moment. Let's think about the roots of the TC. The organization arose from Brzezinski's 1970 book, Between Two Ages. Many of the book's 300 pages supply undiluted praise for Marxism, such as, quote, a victory of reason over belief, or, quote, a major advance in man's ability to conceptualize his relationship to the world, and, quote, the best available insight into contemporary reality, end of quote. The readers then told that the United States is undergoing a revolution which unmasks its obsolescence. All right, let's stop here for a moment. The United States, according to the Trilateral Commission, is undergoing a revolution which is showing us to be obsolete. What is obsolete about the United States? Well, America First, that is a national government, getting along, being friendly with other nations, trading with other nations, that may be one thing, but no, they want an interdependence government. And so they say any government that is sovereign in and of itself for the United States is obsolete. And so the man who became the Trilateral Commission's actual godfather, that is Karl Marx and Brzezinski, tells us we need to get out of America First. That is, the United States is old hat. So what to do about the situation Brzezinski described? He suggested, Brzezinski went on to say this, it's a movement toward a larger community of developed nations through a variety of indirect ties and already developing limitations on national sovereignty. Think about that for a moment. Brzezinski tells us that the Trilateral Commission is to get us out of national sovereignty and be welded together with other nations and other continents. That's why the Trilateral Commission, that's where it gets its name from. Furthermore, Brzezinski proposed forging community links among Western Europe, United States, and Japan. Those were the three that I was looking for a few moments ago. Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. Columbia University professor Brzezinski finally got around to suggesting the overall goal. And he put it in plain, bold English, supported by Jimmy Carter, because he became his Secretary of State, and that is world government. That's what Brzezinski wanted, and he wrote it in his book, Between Two Worlds, World Government. 1973, David Rockefeller therefore launched the TC exactly as Brzezinski had proposed, the only exception being the addition of Canada in the North America group. For the organization's director, Rockefeller turned to who else but Brzezinski himself. And of the 65 original TC members from the United States, 35 were members of Rockefeller's other pro-world government organization called the Council on Foreign Relations. Noteworthy among the original members of Rockefeller's newest creation was then governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. So when Carter began to run for president, he was a nobody. But you might ask yourself, how did he come out of nowhere? It wasn't because of his own foreign policy advisements. It wasn't because of his own ideas about nationalism being America first. It was because he was a TC CFR member. No one can be surprised. And so the insiders, the mainstream media, vaulted him to supremacy, and he won the election in 1976. Ronald Reagan began his 1980 campaign for the GOP nomination, eventual election, but he targeted, quote, 19 key members of the Carter administration who are or have been members of the Trilateral Commission. You don't hear much about that, but Reagan knew about it. His aides said he opposed placing TC members in government posts because they were soft on defense. But when he won the nomination, this is Reagan now, in the summer of 1980, he chose trilateral veteran George H.W. Bush as his running mate, and he later selected Caspar Weinberger as his Secretary of Defense. When he did that, I'll never forget. I know there were people that I was associated with. They were following the elections carefully. They loved Reagan, but when Reagan chose George H.W. Bush, they knew, the insiders. He's had to capitulate and had to compromise with the insiders in order to get into the president's office. And apparently that's what he did, because George H.W. Bush was one of the leading lights of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the Trilateral Commissions, which drives us to as they state, a world government. So visitors today to the TC website will learn that this Rockefeller creation is an independent organization, not part of the U.S. government or any other government or the United Nations, but there's an insistence that it has no formal ties with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Brookings Institution, or any such organization, although many commission members are associated with organizations like these. But they still stand for a global government. Jimmy Carter was a member of two or three organizations that wanted nothing more than a global government. The global government, however, is a Marxist global government, and that explains why he turned over 3 nations to Marxists, communists, and or Muslim communists, Iran. That is the legacy of Jimmy Carter.